Welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing Chapter 39, which is the final chapter of the textbook, and it discusses EMS response to terrorism. This is one of those chapters that I sincerely hope you never have to use any of the knowledge of this in your entire career, but unfortunately in today's day and age, we absolutely have to make sure that you are aware of some of these things and how to stay safe during a terroristic attack. Some topics we'll be covering is defining terrorism, terrorism and EMS, time distance shielding, responses to terrorism, dissemination and weaponization, characteristics of CBRNE agents, strategy and tactics, and self-protection at a terrorist event. So first we'll start by defining terrorism. The FBI defines terrorism as the unlawful use of force or violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segments thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. Now, on most cases, the FBI is who makes the determination if something is a terrorist event or not. There can be a lot of bad events that happen that resemble all the traits of a terrorist event, and they might not label it as a terrorist event. So some of this information can be used in things that are not strictly defined as terroristic events. Now, there are two basic types of terroristic events. You have domestic and international terrorism. Domestic terrorism is people whose activities are directed at a government or population without foreign direction from a foreign government. Some of these can include environmental terrorists, anti-government militias, racial hate groups, or groups with extreme political, religious, or other philosophies or beliefs. So this is home-based events. A lot of people consider the Capitol riot after Trump lost the presidential election as a domestic terrorist event. So keep that in mind. It's things that are happening in this country by people from our country, not being influenced by anyone outside of the country. International terrorism are groups and individuals whose terrorist activities are foreign-based and or directed by countries or groups outside of the targeted country or whose activities cross national borders. The growing trend towards loosely organized international networks of terrorists definitely exists. So it doesn't have to be from just one specific country or government. It can be kind of a terrorist network across numerous countries. The most famous international terrorism that comes to most people's minds are the 9/11 attacks. So, characteristic of many terroristic attacks are CBRNE agents. This is not a all-inclusive list, and we're going to talk about all these a little bit later on, but that stands for chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, or explosive. It could be a combination of these, but this usually covers up or encompasses most terroristic events somehow. We also call some of these things weapons of mass destruction. Right, so moving on into terrorism and EMS. Keep in mind that one of the goals of terrorists is to target first responders, because if you take away the emergency response, then more people are going to suffer because no one is there to help them. So keep that in mind, that you are a target. One thing that people tend to do is place secondary devices that are solely targeted for emergency responders. So if, say, a bomb goes off in a building, a second bomb can be placed, and its sole purpose is to be detonated once responders arrive. So that you take away the first wave of responders, it makes it much harder for people to get help, and then the rest of the responders are going to be scared to enter because you don't know if there's a third bomb or fourth bomb. So just keep that in mind, that just because an event has happened doesn't mean that that is the only event that happened. If we go back to the 9/11 attacks, just because one tower was hit doesn't mean that was the only thing that was going to get hit that day. There were multiple events. Keep in mind that these events are crime scenes. And some things that you can do to help protect yourself against secondary attacks is using the OTTO acronym. That stands for occupancy or location, the type of event, timing of event, and on-scene warning signs. So these are all things that you look for to help determine if you might be a target of a secondary attack. We're going to talk about all these separately. So first in auto is the occupancy or location. So take a look. Are there symbolic or historic targets that are being hit? Are you in some place that means something? Again, going back to 9/11, the Twin Towers were iconic. They meant something to the American people. Are you in a public building or assembly area? Are you in a controversial business? Are you in something that's key to the infrastructure of the country? If you are, the chance of further attacks is pretty high. They want to destroy as much of these things as possible. Next in auto is the type of event. Were explosives or incendiaries used, or are there incidents involving firearms? Are there non-trauma mass casualty incidents? Non-trauma mass casualty incidents usually means that there's some sort of chemical release or something that you might not be able to see or feel initially. Next is the timing of event. So always look at national holidays or anniversary dates of previous attacks, or any incidents that occur in major public areas at busy points of the business day. So an attack at 2 a.m. in a business area is not going to be nearly as effective as an attack at 5 p.m. So take a look at the timing event, and again, that will help tell you, is this a terrorist attack and is there more to come? Then the last in auto is on-scene warning signs. So unexplained patterns of illness or death, unexplained signs and symptoms of skin, eye, or airway irritation, and containers that appear to be out of place. Essentially, if something doesn't add up, then it's not going to add up. If you really feel like something's just strange, the chance of this being an attack is pretty high. So keep alert for a secondary attack. So some injuries and things you might be seeing with terrorist attacks follow the trace MP harms. So we're going to talk about all of these. First in the trace MP is thermal harm, so something that comes from either extreme heat or extreme cold, usually some sort of burn or possibly some sort of frostbite or freeze injury. It's usually going to be extreme heat. Radiological harm, we kind of covered radiological harm a little bit in the course, but that's something from some sort of radiologic source that emits alpha particles, beta particles, or gamma rays. Next is asphyxiation, caused by the lack of oxygen in the atmosphere. It could be because a chemical is taking up the place of oxygen in the atmosphere. Next is chemical harm caused by toxic or corrosive materials. Next is etiological harm caused by some sort of disease. So this is like a widespread virus that's been released. Next is mechanical harm caused by physical trauma, such as gunshot or bomb fragments. This is one of the more common ones to see. And then psychological harm is, we kind of add that in at the end as results from any violent event. You know, people, this is usually stuff that happens well after the event, but people are terrified of going somewhere or doing something. You know, shortly after 9/11, people were terrified to fly. So there's long-lasting psychological effects. Going into time, distance, and shielding. So the general rule of thumb for time, distance, and shielding is keep yourself outside of the event zone as much as possible. So if you do have to enter where this has happened, try to minimize your time. Try to execute rapid entries to perform reconnaissance or rescue. You know, you don't want to be in the building exposed to whatever's in there and exposing yourself to possible secondary devices. Distance, try to maximize your distance from the hazard area. If there is some sort of hazardous material, then follow your ERG. Then shielding, you can try to shield yourself with whatever is possible. It depends on what type of event it is. You can use vehicles, building, fire protection, clothing, hazmat suits, PPE, vaccines against disease, you know, anything that's appropriate to the event. It really depends on what type of event it is. But again, time distance shielding is just stay away as much as possible. You know, go in to do your job, but be as expeditious as possible. Going into responses to terrorism. So keep in mind that anything that we're responding to could be a hazardous material. Hazardous materials can get in your body by inhalation, ingestion, absorption, injection, and it can include industrial chemicals or warfare type agents. So some harm that we see from chemical incidents: you can have thermal harm from reactions causing heat. You can have asphyxiation harm because the chemical is depleting oxygen. Chemical harm, which is typically what you think of when you think of hazmat incidents. Mechanical harm can cause corrosive chemicals to weaken structures and cause collapse, depending on what's going on. And then, as we said before, psychological harm. A lot of times it's secondary, but it can be at the scene or at the time or sometime after the event. When you're responding to a chemical incident, use the same ideas that we've discussed in hazmat. Use respiratory protection, protective clothing, be aware of contamination from patients, and remain in the cold zone if there's a hazmat release. If you have a biological incident, it presents as a focused emergency or a public health emergency. So a focused emergency is when there's a potential or actual point of origin located, so we can focus in on where it's been released, and there's attempts made to prevent or minimize the damage and spread. So this is where we know exactly where it is, what's going on, and how to contain it. A public health emergency is when there's no explanation at all and there's a sudden demand upon the public health infrastructure. If you go back and think about the COVID-19 pandemic, it was absolutely not a terrorist attack, but you can kind of put that through the lens of this. That we would consider more of a public health emergency because there's a sudden demand and there wasn't an explanation of where is this coming from. At the start of the COVID pandemic, we could have called it a focused emergency because we knew where it's coming from, even though we didn't know how to contain it, but we had a focused location, and we treated it as such when it first came out. We had people who were traveling internationally isolate. We were more so okay in this country at the very start because it hadn't made its way here, so it was more focused, but then once it made its way to the United States, it became a full-blown public health emergency. Again, not a terrorist attack, but you can look at these things through the lens of that. Some biological incidents that you might see are caused by bacteria, viruses, or toxins. So bacteria is a mass release of bacteria. Viruses, again, you can think of how fast the COVID-19 pandemic spread. So if a virus was to be manufactured, it could spread very easily. And then toxins would be something like a release of ricin. There's been several attempts at terrorist attacks by releasing things like ricin into the world, usually with envelopes. So we have our major routes of entry that we have for pretty much everything. You have absorption, ingestion, injection, and inhalation. So think about contamination. If you are around the substance, it can absolutely cling to surface areas of body or clothing, so you are contaminated or something else is contaminated. It could be hard or soft surfaces, skin and hair, or clothing. Again, when we think back to the COVID-19 outbreak, people were sanitizing absolutely everything. They want to make sure every surface was covered because we didn't know how the virus was sticking to other materials. We were treating everything as contaminated. If you respond to a biological incident, think of it like that. You want to have everything sanitized because you don't know what is clinging to things. If you have a biological incident, obviously use your PPE and respiratory protection. You can get all decked out in as much PPE as you carry. That's what I recommend because, again, you don't know what will cling to you. Get as much information as possible about the incident. That way you're more informed as to how to protect yourself and how to operate and how to treat people. And prioritize yourself. Use self-protection. Use the buddy system. You should never be alone because if you're alone and you collapse, no one will know. Know the availability of rapid intervention teams. Those are very common on fire grounds for structural firefighting. You have a rapid intervention team to go get you if you go down. That is their purpose. So know what the availability of someone to come get you is. One thing that they want us to cover are smaller nuclear devices, which by nature a nuclear device isn't that small, but it's something that can fit in a small container. They're sometimes called suitcase bombs. They're believed to be stockpiled in foreign nations, so they don't have the huge ICBM missiles, but they have all these smaller bombs. Just keep that in mind that any bomb might have some radiologic effects, and those are really hard to pick out because it's usually a very delayed release of symptoms. It's usually hours or days after the event that you start to see symptoms. So unfortunately, that means a lot of people are going to be contaminated and permanently affected because they were so exposed before they knew that they were actually exposed to anything. So just keep that in mind that any explosion, you have to have in the back of your mind, could this have some radiologic effects? So some types of harm from radiological and nuclear incidents. Obviously, you have the thermal harm from the actual explosion, then the secondary harm of the radiological materials, which is an ongoing hazard for days and weeks and months to come. You have the chemical harm because most radiological substances are also chemical hazards. Mechanical harm from the explosion, and again, our psychological harm. So some self-protection measures for radiological or nuclear incidents. Obviously, time, distance, and shielding are key, especially shielding and distance. Have radiologic detecting equipment to help measure how contaminated the area is. Those are called dosimeters. So you wear those and it will pick up how much radiation that is in the area so you know if you're safe to be there or not. You need to assume that things have gotten out. If there's any thought that this might be a radiological event, then you have to assume that it has gotten out and everything is contaminated and follow your proper decontamination procedures. So responding to an explosive event. This is a lot of what we think of when we think of terroristic events is something explosive. So it could be a very wide variety of devices from small pipe bombs to large vehicle bombs. It may involve attacks on fixed target or a group of people. If you think of the Boston Marathon bombing, that was a fixed group of people that were targeted. So it could be a fixed number of people or it could just be random. It could be, we're going to set this car bomb to go off just in a public area to scare as many people and to harm as many people as possible. So things that we need to look out for. Obviously, we have the thermal harm from the heat of detonation. You could have very dusty conditions that cause asphyxiation harm. There could be some sort of chemical release because of the bomb, especially depending on what it was made from. Mechanical harm, it's usually seen at bombing incidents, obviously, because it explodes things. And then we have the psychological harm. When you have explosive events happen, you can have a stunned response that can last for seconds or minutes where people aren't really themselves for a little while. They're just completely stunned that they can't react to anything. So keep that in mind that you might be encountering people who are just completely stunned from the event. Self-protection measures at explosive incidents. Remember, you need to have pre-blast and post-blast protection. So pre-blast is if you have a warning that's something's going to go off, which a lot of these things are just warnings and they never actually happen. They're called bomb threats usually. And then post-blast is operations occurring after at least one detonation's gone off. Again, remember, we are targets of secondary devices, so just because one's gone off doesn't mean that the event is over. Moving on into dissemination and weaponization, which this is how to get the event out to as many people as possible, how to harm as many people as possible. Now, as most of us are aware after the COVID-19 pandemic, is the respiratory route is one of the most effective means of disseminating anything harmful. It's also the most common means of terrorist attacks beyond explosive. That's because your lungs are a very delicate surface area and there's various levels and sizes of passageways into lungs. You can also have ingestion, dermal, or human-to-human contact, but these are much less effective at transmitting something quickly. Particles in 3 to 5 microns in diameter are ideal for weaponization of something that we will breathe in. Such airborne dissemination can be created by applying energy to a material, such as something explosive. So keep it in mind that something that explodes could have some sort of respiratory irritant inside of it, and that could have been the true intent on the explosion, not the explosion itself. Going on to characteristics of CBRNE agents. So we're going to talk about chemical agents first. So chemicals can be gaseous, liquid, or solid. The vapor pressures and densities vary across the spectrum. Most of this should not be new material for you guys right now. Volatility, low boiling point and high vapor pressure will evaporate more readily and allows it to have greater airborne release potential. So you want something that vaporizes in normal room air conditions. You have different classifications of chemical agents. First, you have choking agents, which are usually respiratory irritants. You have blistering agents that causes chemical change in cells of exposed tissue. You might see that in more nuclear type agents. And you have cyanides. Cyanides will prevent the use of oxygen within cells. The most common cyanide poison that we're actually going to see are at like house fires, because that's what's released from modern furniture and modern clothing when it burns is cyanide. That's going to prevent the use of oxygen within cells. So keep in mind, if you have someone who has cyanide poisoning, they need a lot of oxygen. So you might see that not from a terrorist event, but more from a house fire. You have nerve agents. Nerve agents will inhibit enzyme critical to proper nerve transmission, causing out of control parasympathetic nervous systems. Usually nerve agents will result in death. Some signs and symptoms of exposure to nerve agents is excessive salivation, some uncontrolled urination or defecation. So just completely out of control nervous system. You have to think nerve agent. You might have some gastrointestinal upset and some vomiting with nerve agents. You do have mild nerve agents used in riot control, which you might have to treat patients from a riot control event, but those are usually just irritating materials or things that increase tear flow, which are called lacrimators. So usually those are much more mild compared to a nerve agent that you're going to see in a terroristic event. Moving into biological agents, those are microorganisms or toxins that causes disease processes. Once again, not saying the COVID pandemic was a terroristic event, but you can think of how easily that was spread. So how easily that could be used as a terroristic event is create some sort of bacteria or virus and release it out and have it spread throughout the entire population. And just a reminder that between bacteria, viruses, and toxins, toxins are poisonous chemical compounds that are produced by or derived from a living organism. So some people like to say like pufferfish toxin, or something that you can take out of an animal, or like a rattlesnake, something like that. That is what a toxin is compared to bacteria or viruses. So some things that make biological agents more effective is you look at their infectivity, their virulence, their toxicity, their incubation period. That one's a huge one. Again, think back to the COVID-19 pandemic. The reason why it got so out of control so fast is because the incubation period was several days, so people could be spreading it without knowing that they even had it. So a long incubation period is actually seen as a better thing because you can spread to many more people before you even know that you are infected. Transmissibility, lethality, and stability. So going to radioactive and nuclear devices, this is one of the more rare things to see, but the scenarios you might see are nuclear devices launched by the military, improvised nuclear devices made at home, which is very hard to do, radiological dispersed device, or a dirty bomb. So this is a bomb that has some sort of radiation in it, and some sort of sabotage from a foreign power. So nuclear devices are not going to be very common to see at all, but incendiary devices can be made at home by a lot of people. So that's more plausible to see than nuclear devices. It's not hard to do, and usually we have specialized teams like the bomb squad that are available to deal with incendiary devices. So when we're dealing with blast injuries from any sort of explosive release, you have to think of injuries to the lung. Lung injuries could cause apnea, hypotension, or bradycardia. You could have rupture of your tympanic membrane, so you could become deaf from a blast. If a blast wave hits you, you could have abdominal injury, which causes rupture of gas-containing section of the intestine. This is all stuff that we've talked about in the trauma section. You can have TBIs, or some sort of bad concussion from the blast wave. There's not really anything different we do for a terroristic thermal or blast injury than what we do for normal trauma injuries that we have. So just follow your local protocols, follow your trauma assessments. Moving into strategy and tactics. So if you have any sort of hazardous material, the ERG provides information for how to deal with that. So strategies are the broad general plans designed to achieve the desired outcomes. Those should be developed at the agency or county level of how we're going to broadly go to any sort of mass casualty incident or any sort of terroristic event. Then tactics are the specific operational actions responders take to accomplish the assigned tasks. Those are heavily dependent on what actually is happening. It usually comes down from a operational command from the EMS system. So isolation is key for these events. You don't want them to spread. So you need to think about how are we going to control the scene, especially if there are contaminated people inside of the scene. How do we isolate the hazards and attempt to conduct controlled evacuation? That's something that you as EMS are probably not going to be in charge of at all, because it's not our specialty. That's something that we usually bring to law enforcement personnel or FEMA personnel, depending on the type of incident. Law enforcement really need to establish a perimeter to keep the contaminated people in and the non-contaminated people out. So the perimeter does rely on a few things. Sometimes it's the amount of resources on hand, how many people can set up the perimeter, the capability of the people that are there, the ability of resources to self-protect, because a lot of times this causes a mass riot or mass panic, and the size and configuration of the incident. So this is very, very incident dependent on how easy it is to set up a perimeter. Once again, this is probably not something you're going to be asked to do, but something you need to be aware of, that a perimeter should be established, and you as EMS should be allowed in, but be aware that that is going to be there. Notification. There's usually protocols in place, again, at the agency, county, state level of what requires notification to the federal government, and then they'll make the determination of what needs to happen from there. Requests for additional specialized agencies carried out by the Communication Center based on early reports of responders on scene and be consistent with the already established procedures. Identification is mainly just try to find out what you're dealing with. Again, go back to your hazmat principles of try to identify from a ways away and use your ERG if it is some sort of hazardous material. It is a wealth of information in there. And then protection. Make sure that you are in the cold zone as much as possible. If you have to go in to do some sort of operations, be as quick as possible, and then shield yourself as much as possible. If you see any security concerns or protection concerns, please bring that up to whoever's in command and immediately report suspicious people or activities. Again, just because the event has happened doesn't mean the event is over. Then decontamination, we have to just do kind of gross field decontamination. So remove the surface contamination via mechanical means and initial rinsing. That should take care of most of it, but remember, field decontamination is not complete decontamination. So once the event's over, you need to have full decontamination of whatever you were dealing with. This could involve throwing away your clothes. Self-protection at a terrorist event. So always have your head on a swivel. Keep scene safety at the top of your mind. If you are hurt, you can't help others. I've said that numerous times throughout this course. So just keep your situational awareness very, very high. Are patients displaying signs of hazardous substance exposure? If they are, that means it's probably in the area and you could be exposed to it. Are there multiple unconscious patients? If there are, that means there's probably something in the air that's going to make you unconscious. Are there blistering, reddening of skin, discoloration, or skin irritation? That could be a sign of a nuclear event, or it could be a sign of some sort of irritant in the air. Are patients having difficulty breathing? Once again, think that there's irritant in the air. Again, just because it's happened doesn't mean it's over. I can't say this enough. Make sure you prioritize yourself. If it's not safe for you to be there, you can't be there. It's not time for you to be a hero. Let someone who is properly protected go in and take care of the incident and bring people to you who are decontaminated. Just be aware, keep your situational awareness very high. Remember to not rush in, wait until you are told to go in, follow your incident command protocols, wear your PPE, be aware of the secondary explosive devices, and search all patients for explosives or weapons. The terrorist might be a patient. That has happened where they either intentionally or unintentionally get hurt themselves, and then they will attack you afterwards. Going into some chapter review. There are many different types of agents and weapons that can be used by terrorists. CBRNE is used to remember the different types. Trace MP is used to remember the types of hazards posed by these agents. Remember, the responders are often targets of terrorists. Safety must be of the highest priority. Use seeing clues to identify potential terrorist incidents. Adapt protective measures to the specific threat. Know the protective principles of CBRNE events. You arrive at an office where multiple patients are complaining of the same symptoms. They state their office received several threats due to its role in a controversial foreign relations incident. You and your partner recognize the similar symptoms and decide that these may be linked. What is your best course of action? Should you remove yourself from the scene at this point or remain with your patients? So your best course of action is to treat this as a terrorist event until proven otherwise. If many people are experiencing the same thing as not explained, then you could absolutely be in the danger zone. You need to remove yourself from that zone and treat everyone as contaminated until proven otherwise. So you need to bring this up to your communication center, state your concerns, remove yourself from the scene, and let someone else come in and handle whatever material may have been released or is present in that office. So that brings us to the end of this class. I know it's kind of boring to cover all this stuff, and I very truly hope that you never have to deal with anything like this in your career. In the 10 years I've been doing this, I've never had to encounter a terrorist event, and I truly hope I never do, ever. So I do appreciate you sticking through this with me. Again, I know that this was not the most fun chapter in the world. It's a lot of very dry material. So that actually also brings us to the end of the EMT course. If you've been following along, this was the last chapter. So congratulations on making it this far. It's been an honor being here with you, and I wish you your very best in your career.